ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is known as the currency of the cell for the simple reason that whenever cells need to work, there's only one type of molecule that will provide the potential energy capable of making a cell move or helping a cell produce protein, an amino acid, or anything, even the most basic of molecules that cells need to synthesize. It's going to require energy, and ATP is that molecule that will be providing the energy. When you think about, well, what about glucose? We've talked about glucose as fuel. We've talked about certain kinds of lipids as a form of storing energy. But cells cannot use directly the energy from those molecules because it's too much. Cells need a very specific amount of energy for catalyzing the kinds of activities they do. And it just happens to be that ATP provides that necessary amount of energy. Let's take a close look at what ATP is. In terms of the molecules of life, remember that is a term we use for as a jargon for referring in general to the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. Where in which one of those four categories is ATP going to be found? It is going to be found in the category of nucleic acids, and let's see why. A molecule of ATP is going to consist of 3 phosphate groups, and in addition to the 3 phosphate groups, there's going to be a pentose. A pentose is a 5-carbon sugar, which happens to be ribose, and there's also going to be a nitrogenous base, adenine. And this adenine is something we've seen before when we talked about DNA and RNA, which also happen to be nucleic acids. In fact, if we were going to remove the last 2 phosphates from this molecule, and all we were left was 1 phosphate, ribose, and adenine, this will look like one of the nucleotides for RNA. Why RNA? Well, because RNA has the sugar ribose. I'm going to clean up this illustration a little bit because I don't want these scribbles to make it so confusing. So when cells work, they are going to be taking energy from ATP, which is released by the breaking of a bond. The breaking of bonds is an exergonic reaction. It releases energy. And one of the ways in which cells can be so efficient in terms of the work that they do is that they are always going to be performing this coupling, the linking of a reaction that releases energy, an exergonic reaction, and that energy release goes and provides the energy for a reaction that requires an energy input, and so that is going to be known as an endergonic reaction. So we constantly see this process that exergonic reactions release the energy needed by endergonic reactions. That's what we mean by energy coupling. And so when ATP is hydrolyzed, and bring to mind, please, what we have learned before about hydrolysis. In hydrolysis, bonds are broken. So when ATP is hydrolyzed, the most distal phosphate molecule is going to be removed. And here we can see it in the form of an inorganic phosphate. And all we're left with is a molecule that has only 2 phosphates, adenosine, the sugar ribose, and adenine. This is now going to be known as adenosine diphosphate because there's only 2 phosphates left. And what happens during cellular respiration is that these parts are going to be put back together and returned back to ATP, but let me tell you about that in a moment. Before I move over to the cycle of ATP, let me show you what I mean by whenever cells need to do anything, the only molecule that can provide the energy necessary to do that work is going to be ATP. Cells can engage, for example, in movement. When a molecule of ATP is used to power muscle activity, remember what I just mentioned, one of the phosphates, the most distal phosphate in the molecule, is going to become detached. ATP is going to be donating that phosphate, and maybe I will change here from pen to a highlighter. And I'm sorry, I don't want a highlighter. I actually want to go to a laser pointer mode. And so here we see the phosphate that came from precisely ATP. When ATP was hydrolyzed, what happened to it? This ATP became adenosine diphosphate. Where did the third phosphate go? Oh, it went over here. Whenever a molecule donates a phosphate to another molecule, this has a name, and the name is going to be known as phosphorylation. I'm going to write this word over here because I want you to remember it's a really important word. So that's the word I'm saying right now. Phosphorylation. Again, what is phosphorylation? Phosphorylation is the donating, the giving of one phosphate group by one molecule to another. So ATP here is going to be phosphorylating one of the motor proteins in a muscle cell. By the way, this one you see here in purple, this is going to be actin, and the one in red is going to be myosin. This temporary association with phosphate enables a motor protein like myosin to change shape slightly in a way that allows it to slide past its neighboring actin molecule. And this is how muscles are going to be contracting. Thanks to that receiving temporary bonding to one of the phosphate groups from ATP. Eventually, this phosphate is going to be released. The molecule doesn't hang on to it forever and ever, and is going to be the inorganic phosphate we see over on the right-hand side of this illustration. Cells can do work like a brain activity. And what do we need for brain activity? Oh, it's a real interesting type of membrane transport known as active transport. An active transport that is specifically known as the sodium-potassium pump. This is how nerve cells can create an action potential, a difference in charges between the outside of the neuron and the inside. That difference in charges leads to an electric potential that can convey information or send an impulse, a message from one part of the body to the brain, and again from the brain to the rest of the body. But what I'm saying right now is that in order to create this action potential, there has to be a movement of ions from low concentration to high concentration. If you can picture a person going uphill, well, this is the nature of the work a cell has to do, because molecules have to be going from a place that are less concentrated to a place that you already have a lot of these ions where they are more concentrated. It is work that can be done. The process is called active transport, remember, and in this case is the sodium-potassium pump. So to do this work, cells are going to be needing special proteins that are going, transport proteins, that are going to be relying on precisely ATP. Here we go, once again, this is our ATP molecule. One of the phosphates from ATP is given to this transport protein that is going to be known as phosphorylation. And once the transport protein is phosphorylated, it allows for solutes, in this case, we're talking about ions, to go from low concentration. Notice that there's only a couple of those, to where they are more concentrated. There's more of these purple dots over here. So from low concentration to high concentration, that is going to be exactly what these ions are going to be doing, only when the transport protein has been phosphorylated. Remember that this is just a temporary association. This phosphate eventually is going to be released and is going to go as inorganic phosphate. Immune activity. Well, that's something our bodies are doing right now. There's several people on campus that are coughing and sneezing. It's a flu season. There's also a higher rate of colds. And to be able to recover from one of these events, if you happen to get the cold or the flu, you're going to need to build proteins known as immunoproteins. And that immune activity requires that amino acids are connected. Amino acid connected by peptide bonds to amino acids lead eventually to the making of those antibodies we're going to be using for fighting diseases. And how do we make a protein? Well, look at this illustration over here. So this X may be an object that represents an amino acid. And what the cell wants to do is connect it to another amino acid. But this union is not going to be possible by itself. Remember that the making of bonds, synthesis of molecules, requires an energy input. It's an endergonic reaction. Where does the energy come from? You guessed it correctly. It's going to be ATP. So ATP is once again going to phosphorylate, is going to go through the process of phosphorylating, donating one of the phosphates it has to one of the amino acids that is going to participate in this bonding process that provides the energy necessary for these two molecules to interact. As they interact, a new covalent bond is going to be formed. We know that in the case of amino acid to amino acid, this covalent bond is known as a peptide bond. And the phosphate is going to be eventually released and is going to be recycled. In a moment, I'm going to show you how that happens. And I can go, over example after example after example of how anything the cell does is going to require this process of phosphorylation, ATP providing energy, which is transferred when a phosphate is given to that molecule. ATP is going to be energizing. What remains to be explained as we continue to explore deeper and deeper the work cells do is to talk about the cycle ATP goes through. So whenever a cell needs energy, we have already remarked that adenosine triphosphate, ATP, is going to be giving up, it's going to be donating one of the phosphates through this process known as phosphorylation. And when phosphate is given away, ATP becomes adenosine diphosphate. And what happens to the other phosphate? Well, it's right there in the neighborhood, in the vicinity. But these two cannot be connected again. Why? Endergonic reactions. There's an energy input that will be required to be able to make a new covalent bond between the inorganic phosphate and adenosine diphosphate. Where do we get the energy to make that bond for this endergonic reaction? You got it. It's going to be energy from an exergonic reaction. What may not be too obvious to you right now is, well, where is that energy going to come from? But perhaps it is. The energy that will help a cell make ATP again is going to be from the breaking of the bonds from fuel molecules. The cellular respiration, that is taking energy from molecules, fuels like glucose and other sugars, primarily. When those sugars are being broken by the process of cellular respiration, remember that releases energy. And that energy release, which is going to be an exergonic reaction, will provide the energy for connect, once again, this inorganic phosphate with adenosine diphosphate and make, once again, adenosine triphosphate. When the cell has adenosine triphosphate, it will want to use it to do work. And what happens to ATP when it does work? It is hydrolyzed. It is going to break one of its phosphates and donate it to another molecule by this process of phosphorylation. There's the word again. And now the cell did the work and ATP was converted for ADP plus P. Not to worry, because the cell can recharge this again, can energize the two reactants, adenosine diphosphate and phosphate, using energy from cellular respiration, exergonic reactions, and turn this again into ATP. And so you see, this is a cycle, because whenever ATP is used, it's converted to ADP plus P. When the cell does cellular respiration, ADP plus P is converted once again into adenosine triphosphate. And that is exactly what this ATP cycle is going to be like. Just one more analogy, and I will move on to another topic on my next video. The analogy is this. I like to think about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, as a battery that is charged. And a charged battery may be like the battery in your cell phone, maybe the battery in a calculator, maybe a battery that is used to power any kind of an instrument you depend on a daily basis. Well, that battery will be providing energy and is going to eventually be drained. It's going to lose all of its power because it was used for doing whatever work that, piece of equipment you were depending on was using the energy for. And I'm sorry, I'm getting kind of like confusing over here. So when a battery loses its charge, you don't throw it away. You don't go and get new batteries. Many batteries we use in these days are going to be rechargeable. And so when you look at ADP plus P, I imagine like a battery that needs to be charged, like the battery has lost the power. I try to write down here, it's a battery without power. And in this analogy I'm using, we don't throw this battery away. We don't put it in the garbage. What we want to do is we want to recharge it. And so how do we recharge a battery? Well, you have to plug it to a power source. You have a charger cable, and you connect that to the thing that is holding the battery and give it enough time, enough electricity goes into the charging of the battery. Oh, and once again, the battery is going to be charged. Now, in the case of the cell, how did we charge ADP plus P? How did we make this connection again, this dehydration synthesis of ADP plus P, or using energy, not electrical energy, but energy released from the burning, the metabolism of sugars, perhaps some lipids, perhaps proteins at times as well. So I hope this analogy helps you understand a little bit better how ATP cycles every time the cell is going to be using it from ATP to ADP plus P, and eventually these two get joined again using energy from cellular respiration to make ATP.